And pardon my interruption. Please, Viv, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So we ended up in the last meeting with a beautiful presentation by Ruben and Timo. Brilliant presentation, I think, related to their operations in the upper economic sectors to bring resources towards the impoverished communities. Towards the end of it, I think it was the Bank Up and I were asking, well, you're answering a question, but it's not quite the question that we are grappling with at the grassroots. And we've lived our lives in the informal sector and are grappling very much at that level in the midst of this crisis, where we've faced not so much the health issues at this point. They've not quite reached most of the slums, but what we're facing is starvation in city after city. And just watched a video of Sao Paulo and the gang structures taking over in Sao Paulo today, my wife being Brazilian, to deal with these issues of joblessness, enforced joblessness, and starvation as a result. And that is pushing people into deep debt, the selling of their houses, inability to feed their children. And so we're grappling with immediate needs and responses. Alvin Mbola, we've been friends for a good number of years. Alvin is in Nairobi, Kenya. He runs everywhere. He runs through the slums day and night, working with individuals, working with entrepreneurs, but is also an academic who's taught with us in the Matul program, and consults in terms of entrepreneurship, has his own consulting company, has worked with works with Chalmers Institute, and has many other connections. He chairs the for Urban Mission, I believe it is, Alvin, which is a significant Anglican work in the slums of Kibera, which is the biggest slum in Nairobi, some say in the world. So Alvin is better able to address these issues than any of us. He's studied them. So we'll pass it over to you, Alvin, and let's hope that the connection works well.
Thank you, Viv. Good to see you after many years. Hi, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you. It's good.
Well, good. Thank you. Thank you, Viv, for the introduction. Great seeing and meeting all of you. And greetings from a very cold Nairobi, not as compared to winter, which some of you would experience at your end, but it's pretty cold here now. I think I would had, Viv had already done a bit of introduction, so I think I would go back into that. I would head straight into what I need to present for today. First and foremost, my apologies for the, I've never done Zoom before. I've used other platforms before, and so I was facing a bit of a challenge here and there. Second apologies is also connected to the article which I did, I think, a week ago. Just realized we sent it the unedited version, so it had a little bit of typos here and there. And we've redone a different one for now, which hopefully we can be able to send later on, an expanded version of it, which we are trying to send to different forums that I belong to currently, because we're also on different forums locally with regards to response to COVID-19, especially within the informal settlements and slums. So we have different consortiums and different forums trying to address different issues. Anyway, let me try to send to show a short clip. I have around 10 slides, which was supposed to guide us in this discussion for today. One is to note that, of course, I've lived within the slums myself. I grew up in the slum context in my schooling years. My background is in economics, and passionate about economics, especially within the communities. And so that's what I've been doing for the past 15 years, largely within the African context. Now, I will be focusing on interventions, especially at the informal settlement levels. So really the micro level of implementation on economic strengthening in this COVID era as a reconstruction issue, but also moving us directly into the path of general development of economic empowerment programming. Again, I will restrict myself to what the church can be able to do, has done in the past, and also just focus on our experiences in the past, because Kenya has had a situation like this before. In 2007, 2008, we had a crisis related to elections, and that seriously affected the slum context and the informal settlements. And I was at the height of that, both research and consortiums which were responding at that specific time. Of course, that is different. That is different from what we have today. Let me just get this on. Okay. Am I on?
Yes.
Yep, we got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so we had this experience before, but also just reflecting on my other experiences, because you have some basic fundamentals which are a constant, both in urban contexts and rural contexts. I've done a lot of evaluation work, a lot of capacity building across the continent, in refugee setups, in communities in transition, and sometimes the scenarios remain the same. The principles remain the same. The application of it might be slightly different because of, in slums, we talk of many people having user rights of the spaces they occupy, but don't have ownership rights. So it's user rights versus ownership rights that becomes a big distinction in many of these things. So I will look at the context of Nairobi as my area of focus, and therefore start off with a little bit of where we are coming from in Nairobi. We did a census last year, and it is said that Nairobi has 4.4 million people, but that's the regional boundaries of Nairobi as defined around the colonial period. We have now what you call the Nairobi metropolitan area, which has around 9.5 million guys. Now, whether you look at it from Nairobi metropolitan or from the original Nairobi, 6% of the spaces in this city is covered by informal settlements, like these slums. A big percentage is taken over by green area, which are golf courses. We have a national park within the city. We have stadiums and forest covers, which are government protected forest covers. But 55% of the population live on around 6% of the land. Now, that also means that on the economic side of things, 60% of the economy is actually informal. And there's a very close connection between the formal and the informal economy, because the informal actually feeds onto the formal. And you'll be able to see that even with regards or with respect to how the informal settlements live side by side with the middle class and nowadays we don't talk of first class, but the top class, there's a way they live side by side with each other, and therefore one sector providing services to the other and the other one consuming the services provided by this sector. Now, wages of formal economies pay for informally produced goods, which is basically I've already explained. But the other interesting thing is that the informal settlements have a very large population of churches. The interesting thing, though, is that inside many of the informal settlements, you don't have what you would call the denominational, or what we nowadays call mainstream churches. You have the African instituted churches and the Pentecostal churches, or what you'd call the charismatic Pentecostals. They have a large presence within the informal settlements. Of course, why some of these things become very critical is that as you talk about a response by the church, then who is the church, or what is the church? I know at the Center for Urban Mission, we struggled with that definition in 2006, 2008. Between 2006 and 2008, because many agencies and organizations, be it parachurch or church organizations, want to implement their programs through what you call mainstream denominational churches. But mainstream denominational churches don't have a strong presence inside the informal settlements. So we'll pick up that at the next stage. So the context which has been created by COVID-19 is that the joy we have, and I think that happens with a lot of African countries, is that the economy is not completely closed. Because unlike the economies in the West, you can't close an economy which is 60% informal. So the countries have been left open with a bit of curfews here and there. So for the past 2-3 months, we've been closing our country at 6 p.m., but that was stretched 2 weeks back to 9 p.m. And therefore, the economy continues to operate and the informal sector continues to feed into the formal. Now, the interesting thing is that there have been massive loss of jobs, both casual and permanent. The 60% I talked about earlier, many of them working in the nearby industrial areas or within the homes of the middle class and the upper class, or just other works which feed into motor vehicle repairs and carpentry and second-hand cloth dealings. And many of the clients there are actually people from the formal sector. So there have been massive loss of jobs. But also the massive loss of jobs have also affected churches in the informal settlements, as we'll see later on. Physically, the churches have been closed in the informal settlements, and that's also a massive issue, especially if you have a church leader who depended on his church 100% from the tithes and offerings. Like the Old Testament Levites, some of them operated that way, that it's 100% giving that supports them. But you also have those who are bivocational, who run churches, but also have their businesses on the side. A quasi tent-making version where they do business, but also those businesses are struggling now. So the church leaders are at a double tragedy. Now, small businesses, I've said earlier, are operating. Community saving systems have scaled down because community or cooperative saving systems are defined by physical interactions and physical meetings, because they don't just meet economic needs, they also meet social needs. And there's a very close connection between social and economic needs. Sometimes we try to treat economic needs in isolation. In the informal settlements, you can't treat economic processes away from. Actually, the community saving system is almost 60% social, 60 to 70% social, maybe 20 to 30% is what is economics. And there's a way the two reinforce one another. Then there have been COVID regulations which have been passed across, but these have been imperfectly implemented in the informal settlements. Because naturally, the way people live in the informal settlements, it's difficult to implement them. One, because of the close proximity of housing, the close proximity of people interaction on the streets, and the close proximity of business interactions with the people themselves. So social distancing is not completely happening. Hand washing is complex because, as you know, the informal settlements, people pay higher prices for water than the rest of us. And therefore, water is a scarce commodity. Though government and different NGOs have tried to put in several water points for people to be able to wash their hands. But you also need soap. Sometimes people place soap around the washing containers, but the soaps disappear, they're stolen. So now some of the guys are mixing the soap with the water so that they solve that specific problem. So you have a perfect implementation for that. Now, having said that, having talked about that as our context, what therefore has been our humanitarian response? Now, the graph to my top left gives you a general definition of what would be happening normally in a community in terms of growth and development. Of course, as an economist, I know that that graph is linear and it's perfect. The communities don't have a perfect graph. They have ups and downs along that specific line graph. So the bottom of those they have actually curves running across that line, but that line gives you a perfect fit. The bottom, if you draw curves along that line, the bottom of it would always be like emergencies happening, which are normally in life, sicknesses and education and all that kind of stuff. But when it goes high, it simply means that there aren't a lot of emergencies, or there are instances where you have seasonal income. So incomes somehow go higher than the expenditures in the household. But that's a general definition of what happens. And therefore, in terms of what COVID has done, the graph on my bottom right gives you a scenario of what has transpired as far as COVID is concerned. There is a crisis which has happened, and therefore there's a brokenness in that specific curve. Now, depending on how we respond to COVID or any emergencies, the graph can completely go down, like what we have in situations whereby there is a consistent relief intervention in a community even after the disaster has been removed. But that is depicted by the red curve that is heading towards the x-axis. Now, the other curve that goes back to the green line is the reconstruction, the recovery, or the recovery or reconstruction curve, which helps the community to get back to their normal lives. And that's what I'll be talking about in detail, because that's the phase we are having a lot of discussions around now. And that's the phase I was passionate about in 2007 and 2008, as far as response to disaster is concerned, especially with economic empowerment strategies. But currently, because we are in a relief context, and this is a very strange relief context because we've never had this before. A relief context whereby you are basically defined by a virus, which is airborne, and therefore it closes down a lot of interactions among people. And therefore humanitarian interventions are facing a lot of challenges. Traditionally, humanitarian responses in the informal settlements have largely been done through the local churches, but now the local churches themselves are closed. So how do we go about it? Okay, let's journey and see. One, in terms of general response, relief or humanitarian interventions are always informed by facts, okay? So that you can be able to limit harm. That's a little bit different with this COVID scenario. Now, it is always done in kind, oftentimes because the economics of any area is always completely destroyed. And therefore the cash economy never works because there's nowhere to buy anything. This is different because the shops are open in this specific context. And so that brings in a lot of questions around, if you do food packs like we are doing now, what does it do to the shopkeeper who is selling his products in that specific context. Now, it's always defined by physical interaction, not physical distance, because in a general response, food is delivered physically to the people, either in their locations or in settlement places away from their homes. And generally, humanitarian, or rather relief interventions occur where the safety nets have completely been removed. In the COVID scenario, some safety nets have there are instances where safety nets have completely been removed, and some instances safety nets have not completely been removed. They have just been reduced, especially in instances where people have been fired from their workplaces. Humanitarian response is always remotely holistic, simply because people are driven by compassion and people are driven by the issues around logic of response never applies much. It's because people run to save lives. And then the big thing there is there's always a gap between relief and development. In a sense, simply meaning that the organizations, the institutions, the individuals, the church and the parachurch organizations that do this work are not the ones who come back and try to transition communities later on. Oftentimes, the church's capacity to take it to the next level is never built, even with the institutions that facilitate these processes. And therefore, that gap always becomes very harmful. And if that gap cannot be bridged, therefore, reconstruction always struggles and suffers. So what we have done so far, as far as the response is concerned, is we've done food packs. Now, these food packs have been done through supermarkets, and we had a lot of earlier discussions over 2-3 months back. How do we go about it? We raise resources, channel those resources to supermarkets. The supermarkets package food packs. Through the local churches, we organize, and the communities come to the supermarket or the chain stores, and they pick their food packs, and certain recordings are done. Simply because there are physical restrictions. And when people tried to do it the way we did it in 2008, the government closed down that process because people went into the informal settlements and there were stampedes in different places as people were fighting for food packs. And therefore, the general guidelines of COVID-19 were not followed. But government slowly opened it up after most of us got organized. Later on, we tried to do it through partnerships and networks because different of us were submitting food packs into the communities. And for those who've gone through my article, the crisis you have is that you can end up with one household with a lot of food packs and another one with 0 food pack. So what you end up with is a distorted general market economy simply because one home has too many food packs, which they start selling within the communities, either during the COVID-19 itself or afterwards. And that always undercuts your normal business person trying to do a market-oriented business in that specific community. Now, with COVID, time is unknown. We don't know when it's going to end. We can't predict it. We are not so sure. Like in Nairobi, we had predicted that we would be hitting the peak by now. Now there are indications that we could peak in August or in September. That one is also still not known, and therefore planning becomes very complex now. Resource mobilization becomes a challenge because it's restricted by physical movement. And this is also one of those crises which has hit everywhere. Even where many of these institutions, let's say people from the West, who have generally supported when there are crises in certain parts of the developing South, are also ravaged by this specific pandemic. So people are confused in terms of where do we link up with resources. Then also the other challenge we have in the informal settlement is the stigma. Now, there was massive testing which was done in the informal settlement, and several people were found to test positive, and a crisis ensued from there. Immediately, one person in the household tested positive. The rest were treated, even if they were negative. There were a lot of stigma around them. So people have stopped, and several people are avoiding testing altogether because of that specific stigma. So in terms of reconstruction or restoration, the big question always is, who does it? Is it the same person who did the relief one, or is it a different person? And do the two people connect with one another? The other issue is how was relief done, and how do we do reconstruction? And then the other one is, when do we stop relief? When do we start reconstruction? Those are always very critical questions to ask, because if relief continues for a longer period of time, it makes it difficult for you to be able to start reconstruction. Because sometimes too much receiving over a long period of time messes up the self-esteem of the people and their ability to be able to pick up. And sometimes it also kills the local initiatives and the local resources which are available. The success of reconstruction is also based on the ability of us to be able to properly coordinate the relief interventions, so that we deal with the issue I'd already talked about earlier, of one household having too much and the other household having nothing. The church is at a place whereby it can be able to facilitate holistic implementation. Do we do holistic relief intervention? If we don't, how then can we be able to start it at the reconstruction stage? So the graph then tells us that it is critical that at the stage of relief, that preparedness for reconstruction starts immediately even as we do the relief. So how are we going to restore this? One, we need to focus on capacities and not deficits. Oftentimes, there's a big issue on focusing on what people are lacking, on what people don't have, and forget about what do they have even at limited levels. We need to focus on building self-esteem. There are massive issues with pastors now that a lot of pastors have lost their self-esteem in this process. They're used to giving and supporting their communities. Now they're lining up with the same community members to receive food packs at the chain stores. And so we've been able to hear this happening with several of them we've been able to talk to. The church can be able to facilitate restoration. The church also will be able to have strengths and weaknesses. There are certain things the church can do. There are certain things it cannot be able to do, but it can be able to partner, and it can be able to network, and also its capacity can be built so that the churches can be able to do certain things. Remember that also, having been in theological training for a while, theological training was not always strong on the missiological side of things. And therefore, many churches don't know how to completely have a church, what we call church beyond the four walls, especially in the midst of crisis. So many of them also are only conversant with, let's give, after we've given, then we figure out what happens next. We always say with these things, we need to start small, and also we need to network, as you'll be able to see later on. Because the people who demand employment need to be linked up with people who supply those employment. And oftentimes these guys live within the same churches that we minister to. You could have a denominational church, which has one of their churches in the slums or on the peripheries of the slum. You can have linkages between the lower ends and the upper ends for those who are seeking work and those who are looking for people to hire. Then the big one becomes advocacy. Some of the guys who've lost their work today have not lost it genuinely. There are factories and organizations which have taken advantage of this just to lay off staff, but it's not factual. So then what do we do? Individual businesses. In the context of reconstruction, for now, you need a lot of counseling, even for people who've lost businesses or for people whose businesses have gone down. And this simply means heart-to-heart talking and helping these people to recover from there. Sometimes we bring in resources and bring in money, but what they need more often as a starting point is the heart issues, not the physical side of money. Now, empowering and capitalization of businesses can continue to be done, but I'm always passionate about capitalizing ongoing businesses or businesses which collapsed, hopefully because of COVID. Capitalizing startups is another story altogether, because many of them never survive, especially in the informal settlements, for many obvious reasons. Thirdly, we can be able to go for incubation. Now, we've done incubation with churches or church halls before. It simply means, and it works well perfectly, especially with the youths, who can be able to use that space to start themselves off. Now, business as mission, or sometimes we call it business as mission. This applies even to the clergy. Sometimes there are clergy or pastors who are pushed to start businesses. But not everybody is enterprising. And so in the past, what we've done and what we've been considered to do now, you have pastors whose spouses are good in business. Can you be able to support their spouses through trainings and through capitalization for those specific businesses? Now, training is a big issue because the question is, when do you do training? Traditionally, people do training before a business starts. My experience is that business training is better done when the business has started. The same applies to business planning. It's difficult to plan a business you've never started before because it's highly conceptual. And many of the people who have been able to write business plans become successful at it if they're already in that specific business. And that's what we actually call, we call local resources. There are some levels of ability of people to be able to start. What the training comes to do is to formalize, to strengthen, and to rationalize that thinking. The other option is going for group businesses. As I've mentioned earlier, not everybody is a business person within the informal settlements. A large group of people are looking for opportunities to partner with somebody else to use their strengths and cover their weaknesses. There are also those who are basically just looking for employment. So if businesses grow, then they can be able to get those employment opportunities. Practically, how does this work? You see the diagram I have there. As I mentioned earlier, slums always live side by side with middle class areas. Oftentimes, people leave the slums and go and sit at the gates of many of these estates looking for work. Some of that is basic work, laundry, loan management. The challenge we have with COVID now is that there is low-level trust among the people who are looking for some people to do some work for them. But this trust can be built by the churches in those local communities. And what we've done in the past is where you can get 2, 3, 4, 5 people who do laundry, form a small organization, and market them either through the upmarket churches or market them through those specific communities and link the people who need somebody to do their laundry and somebody who offers that laundry service. Help those people also to build value, help them to build character because there have been issues around character, and help them to build those specific networks. Now, the second part is basically financing these specific things. Oftentimes, what has been used is credit-led microfinance, where the owners of the institution are different from the users of the institution. Credit-led microfinance always works for the upper poor, not the middle, lower, or the ultra poor. The middle, lower, and ultra poor need savings-led microfinance. And the crisis we've had with credit-led microfinance is because the wrong people have always been given credit. And therefore, there have been high levels of indebtedness. And I know there have been cases in India where people have also committed suicide because of this, and also what we call the Shylocks and the money lenders. So savings-led microfinance does 3 things. One, it helps in the smoothing of incomes. In the informal settlements, there will be instances where incomes will be high, and there are instances where incomes will be low. That can only be done using the cooperatives. The first thing we also do with savings-led microfinance is income protection. You must protect the income first before you promote new income. Income protection simply means when people go to a community bank, the first thing they do in a community bank is to help them protect what they already have in terms of assets. Otherwise, sometimes people pick up loans and then they lose their assets, and therefore they fall deeper into poverty. If they were in the middle poor, they actually fall into the lower poor because of accessing credit at the wrong time. And therefore, savings first. Then after they have done that and they have built their muscles in income protection through borrowings for emergencies, borrowing for life cycle needs, then they can now be able to borrow for investments, which is basically business startups and business upscale. So savings-led microfinance is built on these basic principles. It is participatory because people choose who they belong with. It is asset-based, which simply means people have basic resources, they have savings, they have social capital, their ability to meet together. And also savings-led microfinance only happens in stable communities. It doesn't happen in transition communities faced by disasters, or communities which has completely been wiped out, or communities which have completely lost their safety nets. So what reconstruction options do we have for microfinance? I know oftentimes people avoid the term microfinance. Let me just clarify that here. Microfinance simply means small finance, and there are different versions of microfinance. And that's why I've tried to separate credit-led microfinance. That's what people always call microfinance. But savings-led is also a microfinance. So how do we do it? We can't support new startups. And new startups, it's easy to start it at the reconstruction stage, not at the relief stage. You can't do it at the relief stage because of the principles I've talked about up there. Now, there have been instances of capitalization of ongoing systems, and that we did also in 2008, but we did that with credit-led microfinance, where people had lost businesses had burnt down, and these people had loans in credit-led microfinance. So we're only able to raise resources, and these resources were taken into those microfinance institutions to be able to cover up those people who are unable to be able to pay back their loans. And therefore, they continued with those systems, but they were not required to pay back their loans. So that's how we were able to deal with it then. Now, hot money, cold money in savings-led microfinance will almost operate in a similar way, but slightly different. Now, the money we always have in savings-led microfinance, we call it hot because the communities jealously guard it. It is their money. They will never misuse it, and everybody protects it. Immediately you drop in cold money into a savings system, then sometimes chaos emerges because people start fighting over it, and it waters down their ability to be able to govern their system. The only trick is if the cold money can be made hot by the group, then you can be able to do it at the reconstruction stage. And there are different ways that can be able to be done. And again, it can only be done to mature groups, not new groups. So I think in a nutshell, that's what I can be able to say as some of the responses which we are doing now and we've done in the past with some levels of success. So thank you.
Thank you, Alvin. You've given us a lot to think about. Let me go ahead and invite people to ask questions or make comments. And if you want to just unmute, then we'll see that you've unmuted and invite you to go ahead and speak. And while people are thinking about a question they might want to ask, I will quickly start off. One of the ideas that has been floated in our discussions has been the need to focus on educational resources for the local church. And it's built on a comment that you made that the theological training has not been very strong from a theological point of view. And so the thinking is that perhaps a combination of some central educational resources combined with brief local support and help with application and contextualization. I wonder, Alvin, if you might have a comment about that as perhaps one approach to begin to address the issue you identified.
Sure. I mean, as I said earlier, I've worked in theological setup for some time. I still do teach up to today. Some theological organizations of universities in South Africa here back at home. And again, having implemented with churches, these programs are a long period of time. We've always found that as a very serious missing link. That, for example, I was just watching the discussions you guys had initially, and there were questions around building the capacities of pastors so that the pastors can be able to teach the communities some of these basics around economic strengthening. a small percentage of these guys can be able to do it. A large percentage of them cannot be able to do it because of their basic orientation in training, right from formal training and what we've always believed to be the job of the church. Because the church has been defined by a huge dichotomy, that there are things which are spiritual and there are things which are physical. And so historically, the church has focused on things which are spiritual. They don't see how, I know that's a whole discussion which we've had in different forums. And therefore, yes, there is need to start from that specific entry level of pastors training in terms of curriculum development. But also when you go to the communities levels, then you also start building that within their training. The other chaos which happens is that economists like us also would, or development practitioners would now go to the pastors and start training them on economic strengthening outside of theology. And therefore you have morality around economics coming into play, and also the strengthening of the dichotomy, which I've already talked about earlier. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Viv, you are unmuted. Did you have a comment or question for Alvin?
I just would follow up, Alvin, on that area. I think we've got a wonderful opportunity in India at the moment, particularly South India, where pastors dress in white, as do the Hindu priests, and do not get their hands dirty. And suddenly they are realizing they have to help their people with this economic situation, but they don't know how. So the opportunity is very significant right now for pastors to begin to engage with what I call economic discipleship. The word disciple means something to them. So economic discipleship can mean something. But they still don't want to get their hands dirty. They're happy to teach. So then the second issue is, what's a deacon? If they can identify deacons within their congregation who are good with finance, and the deacon is the one who gets his hands dirty working with the people in business, this makes sense for them. So those two ideas, I think at this time could be very powerful, but it does need curriculum, which Tear Fund, World Vision, and many other groups do have simple curriculum. So Alvin, you're talking towards the end of a significant hot money, cold money idea that the injection of capital into the asset-based structures can be done in such a way that it helps re-establish those structures and doesn't destroy them. Do you want to talk some more about this?
I think it's always, for me over the years, it's always very critical and important to look at the community in its entirety, rather than in bits and pieces. Money is good, but money can also be very dangerous, especially if not properly implemented or fused into the communities. And sometimes that's the mess which comes with development and development agencies. Where money has been injected in a savings system successfully, it has been done as a matching fund to what they already have, not as something which is being put into nothing. Because sometimes money is given and people are told, okay, we've capitalized you, we've given you X dollars, now start. The crisis is that you will get a lot of people who will come in without having interest. After they have picked in their money, then they'll be able to disappear. But then what has that money done to that specific individual? is this thing I always call money without accountability. You received money, and therefore potentially it has negative effects in the long run, because that money never ends up in productive use. It always ends up in destructive use. So what has happened in the past is a potential matching. In COVID scenarios or in COVID situations, it might mean that people lost work or people's businesses have slowed down. So what you're basically matching is potentially what they could have contributed into those groups in the past 3 months, so that their capital base is enough for them to be able to pick up cash and be able to develop their specific businesses. The same always apply with businesses. Who can you be able to give business as a startup? It's difficult to give business as a startup to somebody who has never done business in their life. Okay? It's, for me, I look at it even theologically and even from an economics perspective, it never works. It only works, you're better off with somebody who is doing something small and has the potential of scaling it up, or somebody who started something and that something has collapsed. Why? Because every business have a life cycle and behavior. You can't start a business either on credit or on equity if you don't know the behavior of the market, because you must learn the behavior of the market. And sometimes also external finances push people to start big, they never start small. So both applies even in the community cooperatives. You push in a lot of money in the community cooperatives. What are you basically telling guys? If there are opportunities for borrowing, then people will borrow huge amounts of money while their capacity and ability to start businesses is small. So a big chunk of that money goes into consumption, and then what happens is that they become indebted. So they start from a point of debts, not a point of savings.
So you're talking of savings groups. We used to call it revolving loan funds, owned by the people. And you're saying that contributions should be perhaps matching contributions, but not 10 times what the people have put in.
Yes, yes, true. I probably should have clarified that. Actually, where it has been done before, it's either a 1-to-1 or a lower ratio. Mm-hmm. If they have $30, 30,000, or if they have 300 USD in their accumulative account, then the maximum you can only do into that kit is 300 USD. You can't go higher. You can only go lower. You can probably do 150. So that you are not killing the local capacity to be able to build and work outwards.
So during
call it actually inside-out development.
All right. So we want inside out. During this time of COVID, I'm suggesting it's a good time for pastors to, we can work with pastors to reorient their teaching. Is it possible to lay the foundation for new savings groups at this time, or is it an impossibility because everything is so confused?
There is a no and a yes, because the different economies are different. Now, in the Kenyan scenario, there are possibilities to be able to do it, though at a lower scale, because the success of it depends on the ability of people to do some basic savings. For now, there aren't high levels of inspiration for people to engage actively in it, because somebody else somewhere is solving their food needs. Because there are a lot of food packs going into communities. At least on our end, we've been able to bridge that gap and do it together as several churches together, several upmarket churches and faith-based NGOs. But there are also several guys who are going in, and the government is going in, and different people are going in, and they're giving food. So what people are basically doing is like what you'll get in a refugee camp. You just sit, and receive what is coming in. There is no motivation really to get out there. But if you have a situation whereby the economy is working, businesses are working, a certain percentage of people are still getting work outside there, then it's a possibility to start it at this point.
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you, Viv and El. Christine had a question.
Thank you so much, Alvin. Alvin, my background is I'm an ordained Salvation Army clergy, and the last time I was in Nairobi was teaching on social justice to our Salvation Army. And it was interesting for me that the people that were involved in pulpit ministry or the church and those who were involved in serving in the humanitarian sector, there was a competing influence, and there was not an understanding of integral mission, of appreciating each other. And so I found that there was more status given to someone who served out of a pulpit than served in the ministry with the poor or the disabled. And I'm just wondering, how can those relationships be strengthened in terms of the paradigms? And are there in your own ministry, is there coalition building with these two camps, so to speak? How can we, who are connected to the grassroots in those areas through our organizations, and I say Micah Global, I say the Salvation Army, help in that area just by encouraging others to start those conversations? And so it was a challenge for that week that I was there teaching, and I could see that it would take a long time for people to understand, first of all, the history of the Salvation Army and their understanding of other influences that had come over the radio from America or somewhere else. And I'm just interested in the whole aspect of coalition building through integral mission.
Yeah. Alvin, you are muted. Oh, you unmuted briefly. Want to try again? There you go. Yeah, Alvin, we're not hearing you. Maybe we're having some connection challenges again. Yeah, Christine, I think that's an important question. I hope Albert's connection gets working for him again. Especially from the WEA perspective, we're really interested in working through our alliances and really building up local community and local coalition.
Are we still on?
Oh, there you go.
It's off again.
Oh, and now you're muted again.
Can you unmute him from your end, David?
It, for some reason, doesn't seem to be, and I suspect it's because of a poor connection. There, now you're unmuted, Alvin. Go ahead. Yeah, I think he's having a difficulty there. Let's take just a moment. Let's hold Christine's question. It's a great one to come back to. And while Alvin's getting reconnected, Timo, you had a comment or a question. Do you want to go ahead while hopefully Alvin's connection gets sorted out?
Okay, I'm back. Thank you.
Oh, there you are. Great. Nope.
Yes, I'm back. Sorry.
Did you hear Christine's comment regarding building coalition at the local level?
Sorry, I never had it. I never knew my connection was, I'd lost connection, but I'm okay. So Christine, sorry, if you could repeat it. Thank you.
Yes, Alvin, I was asking briefly, how do you build coalitions around, through integral mission, around those who are more involved in pulpit ministry than involved in the ministry of justice or service? And briefly, my background is Salvation Army. I was teaching in Nairobi on justice to Salvation Army clergy, and there was a split, almost a competition amongst those who were in the pulpit and those who were in the field. And so I'm interested in hearing how coalitions are built between those two sometimes competing influences in the expression of the church.
Let me just confirm if I got you right. Are you asking a coalition between non-governmental organizations and churches, or churches and churches, or
Well, it could be even the expressions of the NGOs within the church and those who serve through the pulpit. It's preaching and service. And how do we build coalitions, first of all, within the church on some of the ways in which you've presented and an understanding of what's going on? Are you finding yourself involved in coalition building to build cooperation and organizing the church to work together, both the NGO church and the church of the congregation?
That's a very brilliant question. Now, what has happened in the past is that these two groups of people never understand one another. The NGOs have never understood the church has never understood the NGOs. So two cannot work together not unless they agree and they have basic foundations of why they're working together. So one of the most important things is for both of us to be able to understand that we are trying to we're trying to address the same problems. Because like I've always said, especially in my classes, is that the NGO and the church are focused at the household. Their principal focus on any unit of development is the household. But the two institutions never see it that way from the onset, okay? Sometimes it's also because of I'm looking for the best word. Sometimes there are these assumptions around the church doesn't understand anything about development, and sometimes rightfully so. And the church also sometimes view the things which the NGO do as very far removed from spiritual matters. And that's always something which is sorted through a lot of discussions over time, so that before you sit down to address the core issues, what keeps us together, what are our strengths and what are our weaknesses? Now, that was also a problem even in the churches themselves, so that the African instituted churches could not sit together with the what you would call the mainstream churches, and the mainstream churches could not sit with the Catholics, and the Catholics could not sit with the Adventists. And oftentimes it's because of some historical religious beliefs, not purely doctrinal, but religious beliefs from where I sit. And so when we taught at the seminary I taught here at the Center for Urban Mission, the work of, because in the class, as we recruited what you used to call urban mission students, we recruited everybody from Institute, from African Institute churches, from the Pentecostals, from the Anglicans, from the Presbyterians, and whenever you put them in a class in year 1 and week 1, the class was always quiet because these guys have always treated each other with a lot of contempt over the years. And so my job was actually to facilitate team building in that first week or the first 2-3 weeks. And those boundaries were always broken because people realized that what was keeping them apart had no grounding anywhere. And so the same thing applies in this other context. I don't know whether I've answered you, Christian.
You have acknowledged the issue, which I really appreciate. And perhaps with WA and Micah Global, with our people on the ground and even Salvation Army, we could start doing some nudging or tapping on the shoulder of people we know in Kenya. But you would be the facilitator as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned that because I had Salvation Army Africa. I did a training for them for a week in February. Yeah, so I already had Salvation Army, and there are several things we're in discussions around at the moment. Thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah, Alvin, I think you've done a wonderful job at really raising a couple of key issues for us that I'd like to invite this group to continue to discuss and develop as we go forward. We are coming near the end of our time for today, and before we lose any people, I wanted to invite Timo to make a comment or a question, and then we'll wrap up for today.
Okay, just briefly, many thanks, Alvin, for that great presentation. I appreciate very much also your bridge building between business people and pastors, and that would be an issue I would like to focus on, the role of pastors. I have friends in Cape Town and the townships developing churches with a business approach, helping people coming out of poverty this way. And that is part of their church development. But from my point of view, we have two less pastors with this kind of business mindset, or at least acknowledging the opportunities we do have with business. What is your experience in 1 or 2 sentences regarding pastors and their role in encouraging people to step into business and to use business as a vehicle?
Thank you, Timo. Again, depending on their background training, the guys we trained several years back embraced this. It is factual that not all pastors, actually a big majority of pastors are not business persons. But the most important thing is, do they understand it? What they need is understanding. Then when they understand it, they can be able to facilitate those specific ministries in their churches. In essence, I can give a practical example. Some of the things we've done in the past is, in the informal settlement, probably 90% of the people will be in business. But when you come to church, you are 90 of you in a church. Do all of us know what the other one does? So what the pastor needs to do in a situation like that, set up one Sunday, let everybody come and showcase what they do. Then the market begins from there. Okay? So the most critical thing is, does the pastor understand holistic ministry? Or the pastor is caught up, he doesn't understand it. He doesn't necessarily need to be a business person. As we discovered that many male pastors, their spouses were good in business, but the pastors themselves were not good in business. So their spouses did business, the pastor continued the pastoral work. But he needs to understand the place of the business within his church. Historically, many of them only appreciated businesses as far as tithes and offerings are concerned, but not the practice of business. So we were able to change that over the years. And so they could be able to see it as holistic as it is, not as the proceeds coming into the church. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Alvin. I'll come back to you also talking about business coalition later on.
Thank you.
Yes, and Alvin, I'll be following up with you also because I think we have several topics identified that would be wonderful to develop further if you're available to help us to do that. And also to identify some people who have succeeded in doing some of the things that we are describing with you. Be good to hear from some people working on the ground who've tackled some of these challenges that we're talking about. I also want to say thank you to Viv for connecting us with Alvin. I really appreciate your support in that way, Viv. So everyone, we limit our time to not more than an hour and a half, and appreciate everyone's time. As you see, we've made a recording. We're going to do a little bit of editing of the recording, and then that will be available online, and I will send you all the link to that. And we're planning to talk again in 2 weeks. So I will be sending you a note about that in terms of our topic and our discussion. And we want to continue to build on the things that Alvin has so well introduced to us today. So we will close with that. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll be in touch. And if you have any follow-up questions or suggestions, please feel free to email me at any time.